We're happy tonight to have Gray Perry. He's the Watershed Science and Restoration Program Manager at the Cumberland River Compact. Gray started at the Cumberland River Compact in 2017 as an AmeriCorps member, and after that, he's had a variety of roles there. He currently manages restoration projects to improve the health of streams, rivers, and wetlands through the Cumberland River Basin. Gray has a Bachelor of Science degree from UT Knoxville in geology and a master's degree in geosciences from MTSU. And so let's welcome our speaker tonight, Gray Perry.
Thank you guys so much for having me tonight. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Richard, for reaching out, and all of Wild Ones for having me present today. While we're working on that, I'll go ahead and tell you that my undergraduate degree is primarily focused not so much in geology and lithography. I wish I knew more about rocks, but I ended up in the ecosystem restoration side of things out of undergrad, and kind of jumped a variety of roles, did some volunteer management, Cumberland River Compact, helped with some of our rain barrel programs. Perfect, got it. And then after seeing all the cool stuff that we were doing out in the field and helping with a lot of that stuff. Oh, yes. Since we had so much cool stuff that we were doing, I wanted to learn how to do that as well. So I tried to pitch in and help and learn on the job quite a bit, and finally decided I need to go back and get my master's degree. The master's degree is primarily in geosciences and in watershed modeling. So using computer models to understand how watersheds transport sediment and nutrients, and how to better install some best management practices to improve the water quality throughout entire watersheds. So starting in 2023, that's when I was able to come in as the Watershed Science Restoration Program Manager. Had a lot of fun projects I want to talk about with you all today. We'll start with kind of the general stuff first, and then we'll take a deeper dive in the latter end of the session as well. It's a long presentation, probably about an hour. So instead of saving all the questions for the end, I might stop at a couple of points and ask y'all if y'all have some questions. So if y'all have some itching stuff, I'll make sure to pause, and then we can address it then. So the Cumberland River Compact's a 501c3. Our mission is to enhance the health and enjoyment of the Cumberland River and all of its tributaries through education, action, and collaboration. We were started in 1997 and have grown quite a bit over the past 25, 28 years, and expanded the kind of different types of projects that we do. We're really here to try to meet people where they're at and kind of help them learn how they can be better stewards. So there's a lot of other great organizations in Middle Tennessee, and encourage y'all to check them out as well. And they cover a lot of different programming as too, but we're really just trying to meet with those rather than doing any kind of litigation or anything like that. We go out and we do a lot of education, a lot of on the ground practices to help folks just learn how they can be better stewards of their streams and rivers. So obviously, ooh, looks like PowerPoint kind of jumbled some stuff here, so you'll have to get me for that. Stream restoration and just water quality in general is a pretty multifaceted problem. It is tied in with environmental justice, it's tied in with climate change, it's tied in with city planning and transportation planning. There's no single facet that you can approach it from. You really have to look at it holistically. So a lot of our programming is also trying to address all these different facets of the water quality realm. So we have an entire division dedicated to education and engagement, and that's where we have teams of folks that do K through 12 educational programming. We'll bring macroinvertebrates into the classroom and teach kids about biospheres and food webs. We'll do community education events like this, where we get to talk with folks and kind of educate them about water quality. We also do big community events like Waterfest, or we're bringing families in to learn about water quality. We also put on the Dragon Boat Festival every year, where we kind of demonstrate that we're really lucky in Nashville to have a swimmable river that we can use for paddling and recreation. We also have an entire stream restoration division, which I'm not going to talk too much about right now because we'll get more into that later. We also have our urban waters division. And this is really our green infrastructure division, where we're working in these urban and suburban areas to help build rain gardens and bioswales and do tree plantings, anything that we can help with stormwater management to help clean and reduce how much stormwater we're introducing into our streams in these urban and suburban environments. We also have our working lands division, and part of the working lands division is working with agriculture. and working with farmers to either celebrate the stuff that they're doing well. So we have a River Friendly Farms program where we are celebrating those farmers and certifying them that they are doing great stuff on their farm to help prevent pollutants from washing into our local waterways. We also do grazing schools where we're helping farmers learn how to manage their livestock in better ways that prevent erosion and reduce E. coli from introducing into our streams. And on the other end of working lands, we have abandoned mine land reforestation, where we're working in these remote areas of Tennessee and Kentucky to help reforest those areas and leave them better than they were left after the mining companies ended up leaving those areas as well. And I need to change this slide because we have another division here that never gets too much of a shout out that I always really want to acknowledge, and that's our field division. We have a whole team of part-time folks and salaried folks that help go out and implement a lot of this stuff. They help us build our rain gardens. They, they're able to use skid steers and equipment to help excavate that kind of stuff. They do a lot of our maintenance. So our Root Nashville campaign, where we're trying to plant 500,000 trees by 2050, all those trees require maintenance in order to survive. So they're out there watering during the summer. They're putting down mulch. They're putting deer guards on trees. They're pruning and they're planting trees that have died. So these folks are working hard every single day, and they have sometimes a thankless job. So I always want to thank them so much because it is so important, everything they do for the longevity of our programs as well. So I've kind of started with some very basic stuff that you might already know, and I also have some really complicated stuff that you may or may not know as well. But just because I don't really know what everybody's expertise is in the room, we'll just try to cover a little bit of everything, and hopefully you guys can all walk away with at least something today. So I'm going to use the term watershed quite a bit. And it's pretty intuitive. A watershed is just that area of land where that water drains to a common source. So whenever it rains, we have any type of precipitation and it's falling on an area of land, gravity is going to take all that runoff and pull it down to that common source, which is typically a local stream or one of our rivers. And this is our watershed, or basin is another term we use for some of our larger watersheds. So this is the Cumberland River Basin. You can see it starts up in eastern Kentucky up here, and the headwaters converge at Harlan, Kentucky, and then it starts to make its way down through Big South Fork, and then eventually around through Cookeville and down, it goes through downtown Nashville, up through Ashland City and Clarksville, and it eventually converges with the Ohio River up in western Kentucky. And the Ohio River then very quickly converges with the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River takes all of that stuff down to the Gulf of Mexico. So I always like to think of watersheds as nesting dolls, like the little Russian nesting dolls. You can kind of subdivide them however you want to. So the Cumberland River is a part of other larger watersheds. So we're a part of the Ohio River watershed, and that is a sub-watershed of the Mississippi River Basin, which drains most of the eastern United States. Then within the Cumberland River Basin, we have 14 smaller watersheds that have rivers that y'all are probably pretty familiar with, like the Harpeth, the Red River, Stones River, the Caney Fork. All of these are watersheds that they drain everything from their land to maybe the Harpeth, and then that takes it down to the Cumberland River. And then eventually one day, all that stuff's going to make it down to the Gulf of Mexico. And I didn't want to just talk at y'all for an hour. I figured you'd get pretty bored with that. So I have a couple of different trivia questions and things I might engage y'all on. So how many miles of streams and rivers do y'all think are in the Cumberland River Basin? This is something I didn't know off the top of my head when I first started, and it was kind of surprised me how much we had in our watershed. How many of y'all think it's A, 5,000 miles? No? B? C, 60,000 miles. Okay, we have some folks think we have 60,000 miles. How about D, 100,000 miles? D. Oh, a lot of folks think it's D. Someone said B. Well, as much as I wish we had 100,000 miles of streams and rivers in our watershed, it's 22,000, which by no means that's not a small number. I mean, that's a lot of miles that have impacts from humans and land use that a lot of them need a lot of help. And so speaking of some of the issues that our rivers and streams have, I always like to talk a little bit about how our land use affects our streams and rivers too as well. So when you think of your native forested Tennessee or your native grasslands, depending on what region of Tennessee you're in, these areas that are untouched by human development or agriculture, they are very, very pervious. And when I'm using the term pervious, I'm just talking about land that is able to infiltrate and soak up stormwater when it rains on top of it. And that's good because when it rains, most of that is going to be soaked into the ground. That soil is going to do some filtering. It's either going to break down some of those nutrients and pollutants and pathogens. It'll help filter out everything and then recharge that shallow groundwater table. And then that groundwater table very slowly recharges our streams and helps keep them flowing year round. We do still have a little bit of surface runoff when we have these natural areas like this. So some of that will run off over land and create little gullies and flow into our streams and rivers. But a significant portion of that is infiltrated into the ground. Now, fast forward and with human development and in all of our cities and suburbs that we put in, and we see a lot of conversion of these natural areas to what we call impervious surfaces. Now, impervious surfaces, if y'all don't know, it's pretty intuitive. They don't allow water to infiltrate. So you think of your parking lots and your concrete and your roofs, your asphalt roofs, these are going to shed that water off and immediately either take that to a storm drain, which goes straight into the streams and rivers without being treated, or it's going to be just taken straight to a local stream or river because in cities, we don't want that localized flooding, so folks try to get that storm water to move off of these impervious areas into our streams. Now, unfortunately, that means we're not infiltrating a lot of that water. We almost have 100% runoff in these cases, and that's going to pick up all of these particulate matter on the roadways. It's going to pick up gasoline, antifreeze, oil. It's going to pick up bird poop. It's going to pick up trash, and it's going to just take that right into our local streams and rivers. So that's obviously a problem in terms of water quality. You know, there's a lot of work that needs to be done to help improve that. There's ways to do smart development, which I can talk about in a little bit to reduce that. But in general, a lot of the studies that we see, they'll analyze the water quality of local streams and how that changes as the percent of impervious area increases. And it's pretty clear. There's empirical evidence to support this. The higher amount of impervious surfaces you have in a watershed, the worse that water quality gets as that percentage increases. Now, I also don't want to leave out here agriculture too as well. We really need agriculture to support a lot of our economy and provide food and provide jobs for a lot of folks. But if farmers are not privy onto the practices they need to do to prevent loss of soil and nutrients from their land as well, that can also degrade water quality too. And so if we see these natural areas that have been converted into agriculture, maybe livestock, pasture land, or row crop, those have their own unique issues that they see too as well, even though they are able to infiltrate a good amount of their water. So who can tell me, who knows what the difference between point source and non-point source pollution? Does anybody want to try to take a stab at it? It's pretty intuitive. That's exactly right. So I'll repeat what she said. She said point sources comes from a certain point source that you can pinpoint, that you can point at, and non-point source, you can't really point at the source. So to kind of take a deeper dive into that, a point source is where there's a discernible input that you can really like discrete conveyance that you can pinpoint to, and you can see exactly where that pollution is coming from. So a good example is like industry that has a pipe that goes out to the river. You know exactly where that pollution is coming from. You know exactly who is emitting that pollution, and you can go and measure at that outfall and determine if they're staying within compliance versus non-point source, where I just talked a whole bunch about runoff and stormwater runoff. We aren't able to track where that's coming from because it's coming from a lot of different sources. So if you think about trying to track pollutants from non-point sources in a watershed, It may be something coming from my yard, it may be something coming from your yard, it may be something coming from thousands of miles away, washing into that river and being transported. So there's really no way to kind of find out where that's coming from, and not only hold someone accountable if it's something pretty bad, but sometimes it's just small amounts from a very large area that by themselves wouldn't be a huge issue, but combined all together does create issues for our local streams and rivers. Now, in 1972, when we had the Clean Water Act, that was a really important piece of legislation for a lot of our waterways because it allowed us to regulate point sources pretty well. So a lot of our point sources from factories or wastewater treatment plants, they have effluent limits and they're not allowed to discharge anything over that. And if they do, they're fined and they're continuously fined until they get back into compliance. Non-point source, there's really no regulations for that, not easy ones. Sometimes there's some local things that have been tried to do to address that. There was an amendment to the Clean Water Act in 1987 that created a voluntary funding pool called the Non-Point Source 319 program that provides funding to help voluntarily implement some things that might be helpful. But really, it's really hard to get folks to regulate that just because it's a difficult problem. It's coming from everybody. It's hard to go out and police the entire land. That would, cause a lot of other issues that it would just cause a lot of issues for a lot of different reasons. So talking about land use and how that influences our waterways, I think it's an important question to kind of consider. Where do y'all think our drinking water comes from? Especially here in Nashville, where does our drinking water come from? So A, does anybody think the Harpeth River? Well, it does flow through Davidson County. Cumberland River, B. Okay, most folks think the Cumberland River. What about groundwater? Are we pulling this from our aquifers? Does anybody think we have any aquifers being pulled out for Nashville? Well, you guys are superstars because it is B, the Cumberland River. So if you're in Davidson County, you're getting your water from Metro Water Services, they are treating that water and pulling it out from the Cumberland River. And that is why this work is so important, because we can't really regulate non-point source pollution, but it's something that impacts our fish and our aquatic life and impacts our ability to recreate in these areas. And it's also something that we use for industry, we use for agriculture, we use for our own drinking water, and that has impacts on our health that we have to deal with and our children too. Now, if you're in Memphis, you do get your drinking water from an aquifer. If you're on well water, you're getting it from shallow groundwater. But for most of our cities in Tennessee, it is coming from some type of surface water. So if you're in Franklin, that's coming from the Harpeth River and the Cumberland River because they purchase from the Harpeth Valley Utility District. A lot of our other municipalities have intakes along the Cumberland River or from some other smaller tributary to the Cumberland River as well. All right, before we get into the types of impairments we see, do y'all have any questions in general? I'll just stop here and take a pause. Do y'all have any questions?
So remember, the most recent Supreme Court decision, Logan Profit Enterprises that challenged the Chevron principle. Have you started seeing any pushback on water quality issues in the state of County yet? Governors over that been found, we want to be able to dump this in the river.
So the question was the recent court decision of which one was it? I'm sorry.
Logan Profit Enterprises, the Chevron.
So the Chevron recent Supreme Court decision. I'm actually, I don't know. That is a good question, and I wish I had an answer for you. So it sounds like I've got some homework to go do when I get home. So I don't have an answer for you. So we have another question over here.
Stay inside. So you're sending water out. All the water because
Yes. Okay. So the question was, does all the water that is withdrawn from the Cumberland for drinking water, does that end up back in the watershed? And yes. So if you think about when we're withdrawing that water and what we use it for domestically, you might be using it to water your lawn. you're using it to water your lawn, it's going back into the watershed, but it's also something we use to shower and bathe with and restroom. All of that goes to the water treatment plant, where they treat everything. They pull all the solids out of it. They treat it with, I think in Nashville, it's like a UV light, and they try to remove all the pathogens from it. And then that is discharged as effluent into the Cumberland River. And that's true of every municipality. They have a water treatment plant for all of their sanitary sewers, and that does end up back in the river. And those are regulated as point sources of pollution. Any other questions before I move on? Okay. So I'm going to go through a few of the most common impairments. I'll call them impairments and not pollutants, and we'll see why in a second, that we see within the Cumberland River Basin. It is not an exhaustive list, and there is a very long list, and it is publicly available. It's called the 303D list. So you can go on TDEC's website and download all that data. It's a very huge spreadsheet, but that is provided open to the public for you to see what your local water quality is. So the top one that we see within the Cumberland River Basin, and I think most of Tennessee, is pathogens. When we're talking about pathogens, we're not just talking about all bacteria. All streams naturally have some type of bacteria in the environment, but we're talking about bacteria that is derived from fecal matter from either human or animal wastes. The reason why that's such an issue is because that can cause a lot of illness and can make areas not safe for recreation. So typically when they're sampling for this, they're looking at E. coli. They might do fecal coliform or total coliform, but they're typically looking at E. coli. It has a very short life in the water. So if you find it, you know, it's likely been recently released. E. coli is also, it's an indicator for other types of pathogens we might have. So if you find E. coli, there's a higher likelihood that there might be some other things in the water that might make you sick. So the state samples for E. coli, and when they find it, they will put that on the 303D list. If it exceeds a certain threshold, they will then go and list that as a contact advisory that you can't go out and recreate in those waters because it is violating its recreation use. Not really too many areas that have contact advisories. They post those on their website. You can find those in a PDF too as well. But E. coli, as I mentioned, that comes from animal and human sources. But would you like to take a guess? Where do you think a lot of our pathogens come from? How do you think they get into the river? Cattle. And we do have a picture of a cow, so maybe that gave it away a little bit. Dogs, is that, yeah, dog poop? Okay. Yeah, these are all great answers, and you guys are spot on. So livestock is probably one of the #1 reasons. I've never seen a cow use a toilet, and if you ever see that, please let me know. I'd love to see that. Unfortunately, cows have to use the restroom, and if they're close to a stream, or if in worst case, if they're in a stream, that can transmit E. coli into the water, whether it's a direct discharge or if it's being carried by runoff. Sanitary sewer overflows, if there's a break in a sanitary sewer line or something like that, that can be another way that E. coli is introduced into a stream. We'll say municipalities are required by law to address those. And if you ever see one, just let the city know because they will very happily go fix it. Failing septic systems is another huge one, and this is extremely common. Folks, you have to pump your septic systems. You have to make sure your leach fields aren't damaged. You have to make sure they're installed properly. We have very poor soil in a lot of parts of Middle Tennessee with very thin soil layers. And if a contractor doesn't do the due diligence and improperly installs their leach field, that can also cause some issues with pathogens, as well as some other issues that we'll talk about in a second. And then combined sewer overflows is the final way that we have pathogen impairments. So in older parts of the city, they used to not separate their sanitary and their stormwater. It would all go into the same pipe and all go to the water treatment plant, which for back in the late 1800s and early 1900s, that's awesome. That was a huge improvement for water quality because they're treating all of that stormwater and sanitary. Unfortunately, as we grew as a city, those systems get overwhelmed, especially when we have these high rain events and all these impervious surfaces where we're just dumping tons of stormwater into these combined sewers. And unfortunately, the water treatment plants can't handle that capacity during those high flow events. So occasionally we do have combined sewer overflows. Most cities are tasked with trying to address that. Nashville's under the consent decree where they are investing several $billion to separate a lot of their storm sewers into sanitary and separate storm sewers as well. But it's just a legacy infrastructure that we're still dealing with to this day. So habitat alterations, this one's a doozy. It kind of captures, it's a catch-all for a lot of different things, and it's not necessarily a pollutant, but it is an impairment on these waterways, which impact a lot of our fish and a lot of our aquatic life that live in our streams and rivers. This is not an exhaustive list of all the things that get put under habitat alterations, but these are the really common ones. Dams are really problematic for streams and rivers. Obviously, a lot of dams provide navigation. Some of them provide hydropower, and that's, those are good things. But there's a lot of other dams that don't provide either one of those services. And they cause issues with the morphology of the stream. They trap a lot of sediment behind them, which that sediment will settle on the bottom of those streams and that benthic habitat and completely cover it, which prevents a lot of our insects and macroinvertebrates and fish from being able to utilize that to lay their eggs and to hide and dig their homes. And it basically eliminates that habitat behind these impoundments. They disrupt organism passage. So obviously, I've never seen a fish jump a dam. There may be cases of that, but unfortunately, a lot of our macroinvertebrates can't pass across these dams. And what that happens is you have these isolated pockets of species where they, let's say there's an impact on one side of the dam, they may not have as many other organisms to reproduce with and bounce back to their normal population numbers. That also creates inbreeding and reduces their ability to have a little more resiliency during events that may threaten them, like flood events or some kind of chemical spill or something like that. Dams also, they affect water temperature. So a lot of dams release from the bottom of the dams, which is primarily cold water. And a lot of our species are temperature sensitive. So that might impact their ability to survive in those areas. They also, I'll say they alter the dissolved oxygen because dams, sometimes they will trap nutrients behind them and they'll cause what's called eutrophication. So when you trap all that phosphorus in the sediment, you have had nitrogen being impounded by that dam, algae will start to eat that stuff up. Once the algae starts dying off, well, the bacteria will start breaking them down. The bacteria start breaking down all this algae. They're going to pull all the oxygen out of the water. And when you start removing oxygen from the water, you're removing the ability for these organisms to breathe and be able to survive. So they can alter dissolved oxygen, and they are kind of already hit on increasing these eutrophic conditions as well. Our second one is riparian zones. So when we see alterations to our streamside habitat, as I think how TDEG puts it, they're talking about folks that are impacting our riparian areas. Those riparian areas are just those vegetated areas along our streams and rivers. Now, streams are not supposed to be mowed to the edge. I have to just hammer that home today. You see folks mowing to the edge of their stream, it is not going to look good for long. It's going to start eroding, and it's going to have so many other issues because riparian zones have a wide amount of benefits that we can take a little deeper dive into later. But they provide shade into a stream. A lot of our macroinvertebrates need, again, certain temperatures, so that shade helps cool the water and it helps create these little pockets and microhabitats. They introduce a lot of leaf litter and woody debris that our fish and aquatic life need for food and for habitats and survival. They provide riparian zones, stabilize those banks. They have those deep root systems that help hold those banks in place. And once you start cutting all that vegetation down to the stream and just mowing right to the edge, a lot of those streams will start to erode as that stream doesn't have anything really helping anchor those banks in place. They also help abate flooding. And I'll say that, don't expect it to fix all flooding. But what they do is they help slow down floodwaters when they're allowed to kind of spill into their natural floodplain. And that can reduce some of the forces behind that water and kind of allow it to spread out and infiltrate over time, which is really important. And there's a whole host of other things that that they provide a benefit for. So when we see people mowing to the edge of their streams, they can see their stream, they can get rid of the snake habitat or whatever kind of thing they're kind of justifying it with. We see that stream start to lose some of its macroinvertebrates and its fish population because it can't support the things that call that stream home. And finally, channelization, and don't be fooled by the N on the bottom. So a lot of our streams have been either pushed to the side and straightened out for a variety of different reasons. Maybe a farmer 100 years ago wanted to be able to run their tractor and while plowing their fields a little bit easier. So they said, well, we'll just straighten that stream up a little bit and make this a little bit easier on myself. A lot of development, especially old school development, they may have straightened that stream so they could increase their parcel size. A lot of folks will straighten streams because the thought is you're moving that water faster. So you're alleviating flooding, which sure, you might be moving that water away from that spot pretty quickly, but you're passing that buck onto your downstream communities when you end up doing that. And you're also increasing the erosive forces of that stream. So the stream will start to erode outward and it'll start to do what's called incision and incising, where it'll erode downward and start separating itself from its floodplain. So channelization is a huge issue. A lot of our streams, if you look on Google Maps and follow streams, you'll see some sections that are just unnaturally straight. And unfortunately, it has a lot of issues for our macroinvertebrates as well. Sediment is another huge one. I've talked a lot about erosion. Sediment is something that we naturally would see in our streams and rivers, but when we're talking about sediment impairments, we're talking about too much sediment. So too much dirt, too much silt being washed into our local streams and rivers. So what happens is sediment, again, will start to cover that benthic area and completely degrade that habitat that all of our caddisflies and stoneflies and water pennies or dragonflies, all of these critters depend on in order to survive and reproduce. And that can work its way up the food chain. So it impacts your fish, impacts your birds, impacts everything else once you start degrading these habitats. Sometimes sediments can also carry nutrients in it. In Middle Tennessee, we have very high phosphorus soils. So anytime you see sediment being introduced into the streams, there's also a lot of phosphorus being carried. If you're in an agricultural field, you might have your nutrients binding to those soil particles and being carried into your local streams and rivers as well. And then if you have some brownfield sites where you're having erosion, like maybe where there's an old industrial plant or something like that, a lot of these can have some legacy heavy metals associated with them as well, and they will bind to those sediments and be carried into the waterways too. So what do y'all think causes a sediment impairment? I've already mentioned it a few times. What? Did I hear somebody say something?
Sand and silt, gravel will settle out, and the plane will stay in suspension.
Mm-hmm. That's true. That's a good point. So an answer was that a lot of our different types of sediments, they have different particle sizes. So our clay are very small particle sizes, and they'll stay in suspension for a long period of time. Our silt is our next particle size, and our sand, everybody knows what sand is, they're a little bit bigger. They tend to settle out first because they have a harder time being carried by that water. Anybody else?
We work with farmers to try and reduce the erosion of the soil, been plowed and replowed, re-replowed, straight furrows, rain dumps, wash right into the.
Yeah, that's right on the nose. So agriculture and tillage and that kind of stuff is another source of sediment that erosion will carry those that silt and sand and clay into our local streams and rivers. So that is a huge source from a lot of our sediment. But not only agriculture is to blame. So agriculture, I had to harp on this a little bit because this was part of my thesis. We lose about an inch of topsoil every, I think it's anywhere from 16 to 20 years. It takes anywhere from 200 to 1,000 years to regenerate that inch of topsoil from either that parent material underneath and from organic deposition as well. So we're losing a lot of our topsoil much faster than we can replace it. A lot of that is because of over-tilling and tillage, not protecting barren fields. So it's good to have some kind of mulch or leaf litter or maybe corn stalk litter left over on those fields to protect that sediment from being detached during precipitation events and then being carried in with a runoff, termed erosion into those streams and rivers. But development's another big one too. We do have a regulation and development in Tennessee that if it's over an acre, they are required to create a sediment control program. So they're out, put up silt fences and wattles, those black fabric fences that you see along construction sites. But there are a lot of other smaller developments that are smaller than an acre that don't kind of trigger those developmental regulations, and those can be a source of sediment to our local streams and rivers. And also in-stream erosion. So streams do carry sediment naturally. They do erode naturally and move their channels, but when we're talking about in-stream erosion, we're talking about those really severe events. So it may be that incision I'm talking about. It may be that watershed got turned very impervious, very high amounts of imperviousness. So when you have those rain events, you're introducing just tons and tons of stormwater in a very short amount of time. And so that just creates these crazy forces that just strip away these banks and cause them to erode and cause those streams to incise. So those are all three predominantly sources of sediment that we see in Middle Tennessee as well.
So is your organization maybe in collaboration with the Department of Agriculture trying to educate people about or no-till farming, regenerative type farming practices? That would address a lot of the soil being washed into with surface water.
So the question is does the Cumberland River Compact work with either Tennessee Department of Agriculture or maybe NRCS to help farmers do some education and implement some of these what we call best management practices to reduce erosion and sediment derived from agriculture? And the answer is yes. So our River Friendly Farms program and all of that rotational grazing programming that we have, that's all targeted at farmers to either celebrate the stuff they're doing and help kind of get the word out that that is something that we want to see our farmers doing, or we're trying to teach farmers, hey, these are great programs and different types of best management practices that you can do and you can implement to help reduce erosion. And another huge organization that does that is NRCS. I mean, NRCS, started from the Soil Conservation Service back in the Dust Bowl. They do tons of programming. I can't even fathom how much they do, because they surprise me how much they're out in the field. They are constantly working with farmers and providing funding through EQIP, maybe ARC Fund through the Tennessee Department of Agriculture to do some of these no-till practices, cover cropping, and terracing and other types of best management practices they can do to reduce erosion.
So is it that people need to see an increase of this?
So the question is it doing something? And I say it does have an impact. There's still a lot more work to be done. I guess I'll paraphrase it that way, because it's something that these practices have to be done year after year after year. They can't just be done once and left alone. And sometimes you have fields that change hands. Sometimes you have farmers that have a bottom line, and it may be expensive for them to take that on. So maybe they can do no-till one year, but maybe the next year they're not able to do that because there's something else affecting their bottom line. So it's a complex question, but it does work. There's a lot of studies showing how that does impact erosion, but there's still a lot more work to be done. Thank you for the question. And last but not least, and we can stop talking about impairments. So nutrients is our next to last most common one that we see in Tennessee and parts of Kentucky. So obviously, nitrogen and phosphorus, they're naturally transported in streams, but we're talking about too much. And what I mentioned with eutrophication, with the algae that reduces the dissolved oxygen, this is a direct result of having too many nutrients being washed into streams. Some of that can be from sediment, but there's some other types of ways that can be transported as well. Do y'all have any ideas? Loving the engagement. So do y'all have any ideas on how our nutrients end up in our waterways or sources they come from? Lawns. Okay, that's a good one. Fertilizer. You guys pretty much hit it right on the head. Cropland fertilizers, if a farmer is trying to maintain their yields, especially if they're losing some of their topsoil, which reduces those yields over time, they're trying to maintain their bottom line. So they often input chemical fertilizers to help maintain those yields so they can pay off those loans that they have on their equipment. And there's a right way to do things. There are right ways to do fertilizer applications. But if someone is maybe not privy onto the correct ways to apply fertilizer, maybe they apply it before rain, maybe they're not doing soil tests and they're putting a lot of phosphorus in the soil when we really don't need that in Middle Tennessee. That can be a source of excess nutrients into our waterways. Obviously, lawns was mentioned earlier. So if you see folks who have those really nice green lawns, they look really nice, but if they're not applying that fertilizer properly, that's another source, especially if it's being washed into that storm drain and immediately into our streams and rivers. Obviously, sport fields and parks can be a source of that too, if you have folks that just aren't privy on the proper application techniques for that stuff. And another one that folks didn't mention is effluents. So our septic systems, if you have those failing leach fields and you have that septic stuff pooling up and flowing out into our streams and rivers, sewage is high in nitrogen, and it's another way that can be introduced into our streams and rivers. And it's also a byproduct of our sewage treatment plants as well. Now, a lot of our wastewater operators, recognize that, and it's a challenge because you want to treat that wastewater, but you're still having some kind of impact on that stream. So some are like down in Franklin, I know they're trying out some reuse programs to reuse that effluent for like irrigating lawns and stuff because it's high nutrients. So that would be great for a lot of our lawns. I know other organizations like Nashville Water, they will do dissolve, or they will re-oxygenate the water before they put it back in the river to help offset some of the impacts from lower dissolved oxygen. So there's ways to do it, but it's still a source of some of our of nutrients into our streams and rivers. There's a billion other ones I didn't hit on. They're not quite as common, but there's still a lot of other types of impairments we see, maybe some heavy metals like selenium, copper, and PCBs and whatnot. You can find that on this app called How's My Waterway. I always encourage people to go there because you can just put in your address and look up your local streams and see if it has been sampled, if it's healthy, if it's not healthy, and see what kind of things it's listed for. And there's a lot of information in some very approachable terms that pretty much anyone can understand that I really appreciate. So definitely check that out if you're interested in learning about your local waterways. It's a great resource. And I'll leave it up on there and see if we have any other questions before I start taking a deeper dive into the restoration stuff that we do. Do y'all have any other questions that I can hopefully answer? Okay. Okay.
Can you talk about anything that responsibility ever? And then was every man so long and how can we ever put one?
Is that question like what you can do like at home? Is that what you mean by that? Is the question, how can we at home kind of help?
But in the Cumberland River, in Parkland office, we saw and or the Cumberland River
Well, it's a few different. So I will say the Cumberland River used to not be as good water quality as it is today. So prior to 1972, definitely had a lot of issues and a lot of impairments. So a lot of work has been done throughout the entire region to help reduce some of these issues we see. And we still do have some impairments in the Cumberland, and that's where water treatment comes in. So the water treatment plant has a several step process to help filter drinking water before it travels to folks' homes. Usually they put in flocculants to settle out some of the sediment and other types of total suspended solids, and they'll remove that from the process. They'll treat it for pathogens using UV light, and they'll also put chlorine. So when it's making its way down the line to your house, you don't have a bacterial contamination along the way. So there's several steps that they do in the treatment process to take that river water that we probably wouldn't want to go out and drink and make sure that it is safe enough to drink at home. And they are required by law to hit certain standards set by the EPA, and they do publish those reports. They are publicly available. So if you ever have any questions, it's pretty easy to find online what they publish and what their testing standards are. Does that answer the question? Okay. Oh, I will. Let's see. Oh, I had a pause slide. So I'm going to start talking about some of the projects that I've worked on in the past, or I've at least helped with in some regards. So these are going to be all different types of stuff that we do in our stream restoration division specifically. So one of the first things that I want to kind of talk about is some of our bank stabilization projects. So I talked a lot about stream bank erosion and how that introduces a lot of sediment into our streams. And so what we do is we partnered with a lot of municipalities to help do some bank stabilization projects. So when we're doing this, we usually hire a firm to do what's called bioengineering. And what I'll talk about what bioengineering is, what you see a lot of other folks do is they'll do something called riprapping or hard armoring, or they'll put up gabion baskets, or they'll put concrete channels. And sometimes that can be necessary if you're protecting some kind of public infrastructure, like a sewage pipe or a water treatment plant. They'll have to hard armor those banks, and that does prevent those banks from eroding. However, they do cause a lot of other issues. So when you hard armor a stream, you're taking all that force of the water and you're just passing it downstream. So usually where you see that hard armoring stop, that's where you start seeing erosion happen again. You're also not slowing down that water. So you're just increasing the transport of sediment. It's going to cause streams downstream to size a little bit more. You're not going to see floodplain connectivity. So that water is not going to be able to spill out of its floodplains and deposit sediment. So though sometimes it's necessary, we try to avoid hard armoring where we can because there's better ways to do it. So we partnered with here the city of Goodlettsville and Moss Wright Park. If y'all have ever been there, it's a really wonderful park. We helped them stabilize 2 sections of their bank using what's called bioengineering. So we hired KCI, and what they do is they try to mimic some of the natural functions of a normal stream bank. So they regrade it back at a 3-to-1 ratio to turn that cliff more into more gradual slopes, that when that water rises up, it has somewhere to kind of relief and slow down. They'll put in these in-stream structures to kind of help slow down some of that water too and reduce some of the forces on it and redirect those forces more towards the other part of the stream. They'll put in usually something called soil lifts. It's kind of they use a biodegradable erosion control matting to hold that soil in place, and they'll put a seed mix on top of it. And then they'll also live stake those with native plants, and they'll put in some bare root seedlings as well, native species, to get roots in the ground. Because what we want to see is roots in the ground to hold that soil in place. So usually the core matting will kind of biodegrade after about 5 years. And hopefully by then we'll have some nice root systems established on this bank. So when we do see those high flow events, not only have we slowed that water down a little bit, but we also have something protecting the surface of those banks as well. So this was a great project in partnership with City of Goodlettsville. We had a similar project in Clarksville at Billy Dunlop Park. So we stabilized 540 linear feet of bank with the same firm, KCI, and we partnered with the Clarksville Parks Department. And it's using those same kind of ideas. We're using this erosion control matting to protect that soil from eroding, to protect gully erosion from happening, from precipitation coming down. And I don't have a picture of it right here yet because this was finished last year, but they did put a seed mix and a bunch of bare root seedlings and live stakes as well. So hopefully in the future, we see a nice riparian zone that's been restored. We see a stream bank that's stable and not likely to erode and introduce sediment in the future. And hopefully one day we'll see a very nice, healthy functioning riparian area probably 5 to 10 years before you start seeing those trees get to some mature heights. We've also done a lot of smaller bank stabilization projects. And so you think it's the same thing, it's bioengineering, but instead of working on 10 to 20-foot high banks, we're working on smaller systems that are maybe 3 feet high. We do have bank erosion in a lot of our headwater streams as well as our major rivers. And there's a few different ways that we've kind of approached that. And you can definitely tell that I put this together because most of these pictures have me in it. Yeah. So I have a lot of fun getting out and doing this stuff. This is a great way to work with landowners who are having some kind of erosion issue that they can't afford to fix. And they're looking for some help, so we can bring in some funding and our field team to come and help implement some of these services. So I'm actually going to start over at live staking. This is a pretty easy way and low cost way to try to address bank erosion. It is not a fully encompassing way of addressing erosion, but it's a quick and cheap way that doesn't require permitting to do. So you can see this bank right here. It's kind of hard to tell from the photo, but we're basically taking these cuttings from very certain native species. So like silky willow, silky dogwood, arrowwood, buttonbush, several other species as well that are able, when you cut them, they create these little sticks that you can hammer into the bank. And if they intersect the water table, and if you do this during the dormant season, during our winter season, those live stakes will start growing and shooting out tons of little roots from them. And they'll also start in subsequent years growing leaves out of the tops of them and providing kind of a twofold protection against the bank. So the roots will help hold those banks in place, and those leaves and canopy on those shrubs will slow down some of the erosive forces of the stream against the wall, and also protect from detachment from precipitation as well. So it's super cheap to do. It's pretty easy. You just hammer them in. That's also beneficial because we really don't want to be digging on our stream banks, because that will further exacerbate and loose up erosion and loose up some of that soil. So just by hammering them in, you can minimize how much soil erosion you're having. And eventually, given enough time, that will regrow and revegetate that bank. This doesn't require permitting. I would always encourage you, if you ever have any questions about that, the first place you should ever reach out to is your local municipality and TDEC. They can usually tell you what you can and can't do with your stream bank and what could get you in trouble and what may not get you in trouble. But typically you can plant as many trees as you want along a bank, and it's usually not an issue if they're all native species to Middle Tennessee. So we also do bank regrading. So this is kind of a smaller scale of those big projects we talk about, where we help take those linear cliffs back to a 3-to-1 slope. We put down that erosion control matting. We hammer in those live stakes to hold that erosion control matting down. And we also put down a native seed mix of a few different species. And eventually over time, that'll just get some deep root systems in the ground that will help stabilize those soils as well. This is something that does require permitting if it's going to be over 50 linear feet. So it's always great to reach out to your city and to TDEC before you do it. But it's not something too hard to approach. It's something we've been able to actually do in Murfreesboro in partnership with the city. Back in 2023, we were able to do this project right here and stabilize, I think, like 400 linear feet of stream. And the last one is pretty cool, and we haven't been able to do this in a little bit, so I'm itching to get out and do it soon. But cedar revetments. Cedar revetments is basically, think of an enchilada with a cedar tree in the middle of it and coir matting wrapped around it. You basically take these enchiladas and you take steel cabling and you tether them into the banks and you overlay them on top of each other and kind of create a fish-scaled protective structure against those banks. And what it'll do is not only will it protect that bank from those erosive forces of the stream during your high flow events, but it'll also capture sediment because it slows it down, and it'll start building that bank back out over time. And if you can get some live stakes in those after a year or two, that can be a 1-2 punch to really rebuild that bank back out and get some roots in the ground in those areas. So this one was done in Browns Creek as part of a 319 project we did in partnership with a landowner. They had probably maybe a 5 to 10 foot high bank. It's probably about 5 feet, 5 to 7 feet, if I remember correctly. And we were able to put in a few of these cedar revetments, these cedar enchiladas, if you will. And it does require permitting if you're doing it for over 50 feet, but it is an effective way to help protect a bank from erosion. And eventually these do biodegrade. So you do have to come in with some vegetation afterwards to make that a long-term solution to bank erosion. This is what I would consider my bread and butter. This is something I like to do because it's cheap to do. It's something that is very easy to talk with landowners and kind of explain the process that's going on, and that's riparian restoration. And so again, that riparian zone, that vegetated area adjacent to a stream or river, has all these benefits, as I mentioned before. And we do a lot of this throughout Davidson County, but also Middle Tennessee. So last year we did some riparian restoration on several thousand linear feet in areas kind of scattered throughout Middle Tennessee. And it's effectively just analyzing your site, determining if you have full sun, part shade, looking at maybe other tree species that are in the area that are already thriving and doing well, picking your seed mix and putting in those orders, and help replanting that vegetated area with tree species to help jumpstart that succession. So you could theoretically just create a no-mow zone to your stream and allow that to grow up over time. That's totally fine. There are some things you have to do maintenance-wise to make sure that those riparian zones that you allow to just kind of grow up by themselves to be healthy and do well. And that's usually invasive removal, and trying to make sure that you don't have it being overtaken by privet and honeysuckle and mimosa and tree of heaven and all these other invasive species. It takes a long time because you'll start seeing little sprouts of sycamore and box elder pop up, and they're usually those early successional species that are pretty aggressive. They're native, but they might dominate that whole area first, and it'll take decades and decades to see that forest succession change, and for some of those native short-lived trees to die off and be replaced with oaks and maples and other things like that. So we're trying to jumpstart this process. So we're picking a mix of canopy and sub-canopy trees and planting them pretty densely because we're going to expect some die off from this, and then just letting them go, and usually recommending some kind of invasive removal management from the landowner, kind of working with them to understand how this should look and what it's supposed to look like, and also that it's a process. It's a patient process. It takes a decade to really get it to look how it's supposed to look, and it does take a little bit of investment, but the benefits are many. There's so many benefits to having a good, healthy riparian area. The other thing that I work on a lot is watershed-based restoration, and I kind of wanted to highlight this, not because it's its own separate thing, but it kind of combines a lot of these previous things that we've talked about. So when we're doing watershed-based restoration, this is usually from the 319 program administered by the Tennessee Department of Agriculture. We're required to develop a plan beforehand. It was called a comprehensive watershed-based plan. And what we do is we analyze the whole region, we analyze all the land use, we look at all the impairments that the streams have, and we create a set of recommendations that will likely delist those streams if we invest in them. And the purpose of those is to make sure that we're not just doing one-off projects here and there. We want these to work together to have a bigger impact. So this is something that we've done bank stabilization, we've done riparian restoration, we've done those big bank stabilization projects with, but we're also trying to incorporate some of our green infrastructure and our stormwater control measures, because we recognize that we can restore riparian areas all day, but if we still have a huge development upstream, we likely need some kind of bioretention to help reduce the pressures on that stream further down. So we've combined this with rain gardens and bioswales. We've done depaving with this, where we've pulled up old parking lots that people don't want anymore, and we've planted trees and turned that back into permeable green space. And this is all part of a bigger plan that we're trying to implement multiple different types of BMPs that are multifacetedly address the issues within that watershed. So if we know a watershed is impaired primarily for sediment, we know we need to focus on capturing sediment and providing erosion control, working with farmers to implement some cover cropping and no-till. And that plan really informs the work that we do. We've done a ton of dam removals. As I've mentioned, all the issues that dams cause. Another thing about dams is they're expensive to maintain, and a lot of landowners can't maintain them anymore. They don't have the funding for it. There's a lot of permitting involved. So when we can find a dam that really doesn't have a purpose anymore, maybe it's not, maybe at one time it was used for agricultural withdrawals, but maybe now they don't pull from that source anymore. Maybe the dam's degraded or failing, and the landowner just wants it out. We'll partner with that landowner or maybe other organizations to help remove those dams to restore the connectivity of that system. So this dam right here was done down on Stewart's Creek, down in Smyrna. It was a pretty large dam. I wish I had a different picture of it because it's you can see how far the excavator is sitting in the water right there. So we pulled that out as part of a mitigation project, and the landowners on both sides just wanted it gone because it was a huge, it had already worked, the river had already worked its way around the dam and had breached it. And so it was no longer performing its original intent anyway. And we've done a ton of other dam removals. So we did 2 at the Nashville Zoo. We partnered with Nashville Zoo and Metro Water Services and a bunch of other agencies to help remove 2 dams on the Nashville Zoo's property at Kathy Joe Branch. This is also my first day on the job, so it was awesome to see. I thought I was going to be doing this every single day, and it turns out it's a lot harder to get these out than you would imagine, but it was still a really wonderful experience to be a part of that. So we partnered with KCI and did some crayfish removals. We partnered with the state and removed both of those dams. And then we monitored these areas afterwards to see how the channel changed and make sure that it was performing as we intended. And this is a little bit of a misnomer because I put just Mill Creek Watershed because Kathy Joe Branch is actually part of the Mill Creek Watershed. But we've done 4 other dam removals in the Mill Creek Watershed as well. One is right down the road on 7 Mile Branch behind the Nashville Library. There's a really small low head dam behind that we removed maybe, I want to say back in 2015, maybe it was before I was with the compact. So we partnered with them to remove that dam. We also removed 3 dams with a bunch of different partners along the main stem of Mill Creek. And so there were about 50 miles of waterway that was opened up. There were 3 dams. A couple of them were along parks. So we partnered with local friends groups and Parks Department to remove those. And there was another one on a private property really close to the confluence of the Mill Creek with the Cumberland River. And we were able to remove all those as well, which was a really great opportunity because it's sometimes a once in a lifetime opportunity to do that. And a lot of those dams were also in very bad disrepair, unfortunately. And finally, we did a dam removal at Richland Creek. This was, if you've ever been to McCabe Park and seen the big water tower that's along the greenway right there, that was part of the old withdrawal system they used for the golf course. And so we partnered with the Parks Department there and several other organizations to help remove that dam too. So fun stuff to do. It's you get a lot of benefit, a lot of bang for your buck when you remove these because you restore a lot of benthic habitat behind them. We have 2 more coming up in South Nashville, which I wish I had a picture of, I'm sorry. But hopefully soon you'll be able to see if you visit our website that we'll be removing 2 more dams in Piccadilly Row. They were old stormwater control measures they put back in the late 70s, and they've since failed and completely filled in with sediment, so they don't really provide any stormwater control anymore. And we'll be partnering with the HOA to help remove those 2 as well. And so finally, the last thing I want to talk about is natural channel design. This is not one that I get to work on very much. This is something my coworker Jed gets to work on a whole bunch, and you can tell him that I'm super jealous because it's really cool. So natural channel design is we're taking a degraded stream and we're restoring it back to what would be considered its pre-impact morphology. And so this is a cool GIF of a project on Neely's Bend that KCI did many years ago that we got to go out and visit. And you can see And the original, it used to be just a straight stream that the farmer had pushed all the way to the edge to increase their livestock paddock. And they agreed to put it in a conservation easement and to restore the meanders in the channel and move it back to its original historic location. So you can see that little wavy pattern right there is the new channel that they created. So basically, you're taking a stream, you're trying to restore those meanders, you're trying to take it from a straight back to putting some of that sinuosity in. You're putting in-stream structures like riffles and pools and glides and runs to help improve the habitat and also restore some of that hydrology of the stream. They design the meanders to be certain widths and certain diameters based on the size of the stream and the contributing drainage area. And they'll also put in, they'll restore the entire riparian area along this as well to protect that in perpetuity and put it in a conservation easement typically. They'll also restore the floodplain. A lot of these streams, if they're in size, they can re-dig out those floodplains. So there's connectivity again where that stream can spill back into its natural floodplain, which is really cool. And so I tried to find some good representative pictures. It's hard to find a good representative picture of this stuff, but I did the best I could, so bear with me. So they're putting in structures like this. This is a cross vein. They also put in things called J hooks and stone toe and a bunch of other ones that I'm not super privy on. But they do things like they provide grade control so the stream doesn't try to head cut its way, because what a stream will do is it'll start eroding downward and then up the stream channel. It'll work its way all the way up to the headwaters of the stream as it tries to reform itself. And if you left it 2,000 years, it might eventually find its way back to equilibrium. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to jumpstart this process. We don't want to wait 2,000 years and have a stream that's so degraded it can't support fish and aquatic life. You know, we want it to look like it did 1,000 years ago today, so that we can have macrovertebrates and fish and other animals kind of repopulate these areas too. This usually takes a lot of design from a firm to put in these in-stream structures to restore some of the morphology and slow down that water and allow it to meander as it normally would. You can kind of see here where they have restored that floodplain. There's a little bit of a shelf that you can see that they've created. And what they'll do is they'll run flood modeling to determine how the stream is supposed to respond in a flood event and reconstruct that floodplain so that when it hits those 50-year, 100-year flood events, it is able to go back into those floodplains and deposit sediment and slow that water down. They'll also do that riparian restoration. So you can see there's a ton of trees that we planted. This is a project we'll touch base on in a little bit. You have to get trees in to those areas because if with natural channel design, if it's not done meticulously from point A to point B, it can be a runaway freight train. So you have to make sure that every structure is designed appropriately, and you have to make sure that you're restoring those riparian areas too, so that stream in perpetuity will be able to exist and be a stable system. And so this is the kind of deep dive I wanted to touch base on a little bit is the Trace Creek stream restoration that we are still working on, but nearing completion. This is down in the border between Davidson and Williamson County. If you've ever taken Highway 100 and past the Kroger on Highway 100 going down to Nash's Trace, there's a little road called Pasco Road down there, and there is a development that was like a suburban development that is being developed back there. And the developers, it's a conservation subdivision. And so they said, well, we'd like to work with someone that can actually restore the stream and put it in an easement and protect it in perpetuity so that we can actually kind of celebrate our status as a conservation subdivision. So you can see right here, the kind of green area is the streams that is running through that subdivision right there. And then the other part of the restoration project is that teal area that is on previously agricultural land where I think they may have run cattle or something like that. So it's about 2.6 miles of streams that are being restored, full natural channel design, 44 acres of green space permanently protected in conservation easement. Here's kind of where it's located. So it is the streams, the headwaters are connected to the Natchez Trace Parkway. So there is a little bit of contiguity between these wildlife corridors, which we like to see. We don't like to see fragmented habitat. We like to see habitat that's connected so a lot of our creatures can move and utilize these spaces. So this is Jed. This is the guy that heads this stuff. You can see him standing in the channel originally on the top, and he's probably about 6 feet tall. So the stream has incised itself pretty badly. It's probably cut down 5 to 10 feet right there. And then you can see him on the bottom after the natural channel design has happened, and they have I think in this case, they actually moved that channel back into its original location, and it is now more connected to its floodplain, so that when you do have those major storm events, will provide some relief to those areas downstream. So it's currently impaired by habitat alterations and sedimentation, so no surprise, it's on our top 4 list that we have. We're hoping in the next probably 10 to 20 years, it will not have those issues anymore. There'll probably be a dip in water quality initially, but it takes time for these systems to get back in equilibrium and for those plants to grow. So the hope is that eventually this system will be much more stable and will not be impaired for sediment and habitat alterations. Historically, it was a farm. It's now in that conservation subdivision. And I've got a nice little aerial of a drone going over the whole project. So this takes a long time to do. It started back in 2018 when the developers reached out to us to try to do this. And after getting approval from the Corps of Engineers and TDEC and getting all the design and the permitting together, after signing the conservation easement on the property, the construction started in November of 2023 last year, and we're hoping to finish it up. It says hopefully by the end of 2024, but I can tell you I learned from Jed, it's going to be January 2025. So hopefully we'll have the 17,000 remainder trees planted by then. So this is part of our stream mitigation program, and I wanted to touch just a little bit on that right there, and I'll try to do it as much justice as I can. So it's our in lieu fee program. For folks not familiar with stream mitigation, it is where if there's an impact somewhere on a stream by a developer, or maybe if there's a roadway being put in, maybe they're impacting 100 feet here, maybe 200 feet here, they have to pay for to offset that impact. And they can't, well, in some cases, they may try to do that restoration on site themselves, but often what folks will do is they will pay either a mitigation banker or they will pay for mitigation credits from us. And what we'll do is we will pool in all that funding together and restore streams and other areas that are degraded. And we'll take that and have a very high impact project. So all those little 100-foot impacts here and there can be sometimes 2 to 10 miles of stream restored somewhere else. And we agree it's not ideal that we have impacts of streams, but it's a huge thing to have in this world where they are required to pay for it. I mean, if we didn't have that, that's something that would not be passed today. And we like to have responsible people in the pilot seat of this with conservation in mind, so we don't just have anybody out there doing poor quality mitigation projects, which we've seen in other places in this country in the past. There have been some poor quality mitigation projects, and so what we really like to prioritize is high quality mitigation projects where we can show a really nice functional uplift of a system, where we're taking it from a severely degraded state back into a healthy state and then protect that in perpetuity forever. And you can't joke around with this. This takes a lot, and I know a little bit about stream morphology, but I'm not an engineer, so I can't answer tons of questions about this kind of stuff, but I wanted to show some of the stuff that went into this. So if you imagine that 2.6 miles of stream, that requires hundreds of engineering plats with every single in-stream feature marked out in detail to the foot, so that when the construction team comes in, they can follow those plans and build something that will be stable. So here you can see where they've put in that floodplain. They're looking at their regrading of those banks, so they're that 3-to-1 ratio. They'll put in those soil lifts, and they'll put in something called wood toe that will degrade over time, but it'll protect that stream in its initial infancy from eroding in that kind of sensitive toe of the bank area. And then they'll putting in these geolifts here, which is that I call them soil mattresses. And then they put in those live stakes, which you can see that they have lined out here. They look at the longitudinal profiles. They look at the cross sections. Here's a cross vein structure that they have here as well, where they've denoted the scour pools. So they're really looking at this from every angle to make sure that this is something that will succeed. And so here are pictures of the Stevens Valley project. I tried to do my best to pick the best ones I could. So you can see where they put in some of these cross vein structures. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of J hooks and cross veins and wood toe, all kinds of features here to help not only make the stream stable, but also improve habitat. We've got riffles that we're trying to put in to reoxygenate that water and slow down that water as it's coming through. We have pool structures as well, which are important microhabitats for fish and macroinvertebrates. They spent a lot of that time relocating that channel in the headwaters, recreating that floodplain, creating all these in-stream features, and installing these in-stream features as well. Then in last year, no, not last year, this happened this year. Wow, it's been a crazy year. In February through March, we planted the first half of the project, which is about 14,000 trees, all native species. There's a lot of detail that goes in the planting. You don't just spray and pray, really. You're looking at certain species that will do well in certain parts. So the upper parts of the floodplain, you're putting less flood tolerant species that can only tolerate occasional flooding. And then in the floodplains, you have willows and dogwood, things that are going to do really well and respond really well to having that repeated flooding and those smaller flood events too. It also includes live staking to help put this erosion control matting down and protect. A seed mix, they'll put in a temporary seed mix, some kind of annual ryegrass or something that'll die off after the first year, but it'll provide some initial protection. And then they're putting in tons of native seed that eventually, year after year, will start to establish itself as well. And you can actually see this was in late summer on under the monitoring photo right there. Those are all the beggar ticks that came out. So just explosion of yellow on about 44 acres of land, which is really beautiful to see. So not only did we do that riparian plan, that will be finished up. We have another 17,000 to plant in January. And then afterwards, we are required to monitor this for the next 7 years. So when we're doing monitoring, we are looking at the longitudinal profiles, looking at the cross sections. So we're taking survey equipment out and seeing how this channel is responding to these changes and making sure that it's stable. And we're required by law to go in and address any issues that we see. And we also want to make sure that this is done well and appropriately because we want to see this succeed forever. There's that permanent conservation easement that's put on. That's about 50 feet from either side of the stream. And within that conservation easement, we have vegetative plots where we're assessing the diversity of stuff coming up. We want to make sure we maintain a certain stem density of seedlings that are surviving. We want to make sure that we don't have actually less than 5% invasive coverage in these areas. So there's a lot of invasive removals and management that come in afterwards. And we're also making sure we don't have one native species that's overtaken. We have to make sure that we are having a very healthy succession going on through this. And we have to go out each year and do these vegetative assessments to make sure that this is responding in a healthy way. And we also, we mark these easement boundaries, and we do, after that 7-year very intense monitoring, we do annual monitoring to make sure that we don't have encroachment on these riparian areas. So we have satellite imagery that we look at, but we also have in-person monitoring that we do. So we're trying to make sure we don't have folks that get a little angsty with their lawnmower, or maybe someone that's tried to cut some trails through something they're not supposed to. These are conservation easements, so there's a very severe limit on what you can use those lands for. So you might be able, if it wasn't a subdivision, you might be able to hunt in it. I wouldn't recommend doing that in a subdivision in the middle of Williamson County. But we are not even letting people mow into it. They have to allow it to stay untouched. At the most, they can probably walk into it to walk to see the creek, but we're even discouraging that as this system is trying to develop and become more resilient. So we put these boundaries up, I think every 100 feet to very clearly delineate where that boundary line is too as well. And we work very closely with the HOA as well to make sure that everything's being respected as it should be. And that's protected in perpetuity, which is really rare. It's really hard to find folks that are willing to put all those restrictions on that land forever. So we were really happy with the partnership with them. I think that was a really unique opportunity. It's one of the largest at least suburban stream restoration projects in Tennessee. It's very rare to see that. A lot of our mitigation projects are out in very rural areas where we have maybe a couple of landowners where we can restore, 50 miles of stream without having a lot of property ownerships to deal with. So this was a very unique opportunity to do in Davidson County and Williamson County. So that's all I really have for y'all today. Happy to answer any questions from y'all. We also have some materials in the back at the end. If y'all don't have a chance to say hi to me, please feel free to check out the website and everything. So let's take some questions. How much overtime did I go? Oh, yeah, it's 8:30. Wow. Oh, thank you. So I think we have two questions. So I'll take yours first.
What is it take to get to Bordeaux and Antioch? That's better.
Okay. So the question is, this is a unique opportunity to do this in Williamson County, but what about doing stream mitigation, natural channel design projects in more underserved communities, maybe in Nashville, more urban areas? And the answer to that is we love to. If you have a site, please tell us. There's a lot of funding available to do this kind of work. The problem is what is eligible for sites. So you usually have to have a mile of stream where both sides of that stream can be put in that conservation easement. And unfortunately, in a lot of these urban areas, it's really hard to find areas that you could do that. And there's a few other things too as well. You have to make sure you're demonstrating that you're providing what's called functional lift to the system. So if there's an area where it's primarily wooded, but it may be still in Davidson County, it may not qualify for mitigation because you can't generate enough credits to pay for the project, but the project will still be pretty expensive. And there's a few other things too as well, some other considerations you have to make sure that it is a viable project. But I always encourage you, if you know an area like that, we'd love to see it because we want to do that kind of stuff. And sometimes if we don't have funding to do that for mitigation, for example, we can find other funding sources for it. So, for example, those dam removals down on Piccadilly Row in South Nashville, we actually did look into mitigation for those, and they weren't eligible when we talked to the Corps of Engineers, and we kind of assessed financially if we could do that. So what we did is we applied for funding through the American Rescue Plan through TDEC, a $1 million grant to help remove both of those dams and restore that stream as well. So sometimes there's other opportunities. They're kind of Hail Marys sometimes, but sometimes you do get them, and we love to do those kind of projects. I'll get his first and then yours. How does that sound?
I think kind of touched on it last answer, but I'm just curious how you, as a organization, how you will prioritize the criteria that makes something more urgent, or that
So the question is how do we prioritize projects? And do you mean specifically in terms of mitigation or just all stream restoration projects? There's a lot of different things. So For one, if we have a restricted grant in a certain service area, we're definitely looking at that service area because we only have funding within that particular smaller watershed. We're looking at areas that have valuable ecology. Maybe there's threatened and endangered species that we can help improve habitat on. There's a lot of different things that kind of go into it. Sometimes it's a public need and exigency. Maybe a landowner is really losing a lot of bank erosion and they really need help. They can't pay for it. The city can't pay for it because it's on private property. So sometimes they'll reach out to us and we can try to come in and help with that too as well. So we like to prioritize projects that have good biodiversity, but if the public exigency is there and we have some funding and can help them out, sometimes those projects can also be prioritized too. But in general, whenever we can find projects, we're happy to try to at least see if we can make them happen. Right.
That is a question to Space Creek excavation.
Okay.
I actually help spring county twisting. And then he probably ended up a car, but decided to party for a huge pile of nothing. Which we are without. And what so. But we get replant and that day we have like about 100 to 200 trees. We are only 5 or 6 species of trees. So actually, it will not increase biodiversity of trees by moving very much with trees. And even by different aging or
Sure. So the So the question is, during the Trace Creek Restoration Project, we did have to remove a lot of trees in order to do the stream restoration. And then when we replanted them with root Nashville and a portion of the project, we only put in 5 or 6 different species. There's a few different things here. So with natural channel design, unfortunately, and with bank stabilization projects, sometimes you do have to remove some of the mature trees. If it's a natural channel design project, you're having to recreate that channel. And the only way you can do that is by getting an excavator and recreating that floodplain. And fortunately, you do have to remove those trees. But we are required by law to maintain that stem density. I think it's 210 trees per acre for the next 7 years after that to make sure that we will have some kind of functional uplift afterwards. So there will be an initial decrease in quality, but we're hopefully jumpstarting it to be a much healthier state later. So unfortunately, we do try to leave those trees when we can. And there were parts of the project where they did leave trees because the channel they were able to work within without removing the trees. But sometimes you do have to remove some of those mature trees, fortunately. Now, in terms of the 5 or 6 species we planted, that was a unique opportunity because a very small sliver of that project was in Davidson County. So we could partner with the Root Nashville program to put in some larger 1-inch caliper trees. Typically, when we do these projects, we don't plant 1-inch caliper trees. We plant seedlings, and we plant them in a much denser density. So we actually there were other seedlings planted in between those other larger 1-inch caliper trees. The Root Nashville campaign, we work with a contract grower to grow probably 5 or 6 different species. So we know that we will have trees coming in each year and we don't run out, and we can guarantee we have a certain amount of species. So those 5 or 6 species were the ones that we had for that portion of the project. But we did bolster that with, I think I saw some sycamore when I was out there, and there's a whole planting list of probably like 30 or 40 different trees that were on there, in addition to a seed mix that was planted on top of all those Root Nashville trees that were put in too. Does that answer the question? And I actually do have the species lists if you want to look at them. I've got the PDFs of them so you can see what was planted throughout the entire project area. So let me know if you would like to see that. I'm happy to pull them up.
I just want to, you know, my BDP out that and understand what to do. We could go for this week, improvements,
Yeah, it hurt, yeah, it hurts us too. We don't like doing that, trust me. It's hopefully to put it in a good and, on a good path. We have another question over here.
Science in 5 years. 100 what? In the design, obviously, you know, like what happened with Cuberland, you just can't see, you can't design that.
That is a good question. And so the question is, what is the design standard for these projects? I don't know. I know these engineering firms are the ones that are tasked with that. They will run flood modeling on these areas, and they'll design a floodplain to handle some of those flows. I don't know if they're looking at a 500-year floodplain. I imagine it's probably around a 100-year floodplain, but I'd have to look at our design specification for those projects to see exactly what that standard is. So I'm not sure, but it is something that is highly regulated by FEMA and the Corps of Engineers. So whoever we hire to do those designs is very meticulously combed over by the state agency and federal agencies to make sure that it is something that is going to last for a long period of time. And if we have a 1,000-year flood event, there may be no way to design for something like that, unfortunately, but they're also looking, when they're designing these streams, they're looking at other reference streams is what they're called. So we look for, a reference stream is a stream that is likely still in its original condition because it doesn't have a lot of development around it. So what we can do is we can look at these reference streams and say, okay, here's the size of our channel. This is a C-type channel, and this is how big it is. And based on this contributing drainage area that we have. And if these 4 or 5 different reference streams for this particular ecoregion look like this, our stream should also look like this, and the channel should be this shape, and the meanders should be this size. So I know that there is a consideration for how other streams that are not impacted look incorporated into those designs as well.
Let's thank Greg once again, and we can hang around a few minutes and